Greetings. How's it going?
Things are going great in Kansas since we are the national champions of basketball yet again, although we have won more often than that in academic debate.
Yeah, I think I remember driving in a time or two to a billboard
That's
for a
right.
debate.
That's right. We have a billboard that points out how we've won more often in academic debate than we have in basketball, which is basketball's working hard to catch up with us, and we appreciate that.
I love that they have a billboard for debate. That's amazing.
Right.
So I figured I would like to start out with the question: how did you come to become an editor, and why?
Well, I had a little bit of experience as an editor. Kate Polchewski asked me to edit a special issue about the influence of Tom Goodnight's work on spheres of argument. And I had been part of the special issue on spheres of argument all those years ago. And Tom is somebody I've known forever. And so I got some experience there. And then I was contacted by Leah Ceccarelli, who asked me if I was interested. And so I applied to be editor of Western. And I was especially interested in Western because Western always reflects the entirety of the discipline. And at the
Which discipline?
The entirety of the discipline. So it does social science, it does rhetoric, it does the breadth of everything. And there are not many journals, there are other journals that do that, but not with nearly the reach of Western and the number of submissions. Western has, when I was editor, we essentially got a submission every other day. And I'm not talking about a resubmission, I'm talking about a new submission, about 180 submissions a year, which is comparable with journals that are universally thought of as national journals. And more, and frankly, Western gets more submissions than very fine journals like the Quarterly Journal of Speech or Rhetoric and Public Affairs. And so the quantity of submissions means that, and the fact that you cover the entire breadth of the discipline means, in a way, Western is unique in that that combination of quantity and quality makes it, in a way, a flagship journal for the whole discipline, representing the entirety of the field, and but getting the same quantity of submission as national journals.
And when you say the discipline, because we're talking to a broader audience, which discipline are you talking about?
I mean all of rhetorical studies. If argument is a subset of rhetoric, and by rhetorical studies, I would also include any communication studies. I would include social scientific approaches. And so it really gives the journal a wide impact across. You can view it as one large discipline of communication, or you can view it as multiple subdisciplines. But we certainly focus on argumentation and rhetoric as key areas of influence.
Excellent. And this sort of answers my secondary question, which is, how do you envision it participating in the larger interdisciplinary conversations?
Well, I think Western, in many cases, has helped set the interdisciplinary conversation. I mean, the most obvious area is the every 10-year special issue on the status of rhetorical criticism. And that has really spawned disciplinary dialogue literally for multiple decades.
Yeah.
And I had the opportunity. It was this was a time where there was a rhetorician who was actually the editor at the time, and I made sure that we reflected the diversity of the field in terms of methodology, of topics, of identity, all of those things. And I was told by a very distinguished senior scholar, David Zarefsky, that he thought it really reflected where the discipline was and was going. So I think we helped establish a kind of a marker of where the discipline is and where the discipline might go.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that's a really good example. I remember that special issue. I believe Leah was the respondent for that.
Dr. Ceccarelli, I thought of her as kind of this generation's equivalent of David Zarefsky, high praise indeed. because she writes so well, but she also is willing to cut against the grain if she looks at the arguments and say, well, they really just don't quite match the claims. And so I appreciated the chance to work with her and any number of other extraordinary scholars.
Yeah, absolutely. So can you tell us a little bit about the publishing house that Western was with and how that might influence editorial decisions?
I was happy to say that Taylor and Francis had very little influence on what I did. Now, I went to a training program and their headquarters in Philadelphia. The training program was most helpful for telling me about corporate policies, et cetera. But I was given total free rein in putting together an editorial board, and I did not have controversies, nor did I seek input from Taylor and Francis. The one thing I wanted from them was to publicize, when we had especially important essays. And I thought within the limits of a corporate structure that Taylor and Francis was very helpful. So I really was pleased with that, mostly that Taylor and Francis created an atmosphere where the academics ran the show, which, when you think about academic, freedom, the academics ought to be calling the shots.
Absolutely.
And I also had the advantage that we had so many submissions, and perhaps because of my background in academic debate and other experiences, I processed submissions pretty rapidly so that we quite soon had plenty of essays that had been accepted and passed the copy edit stage and been published online that were simply waiting for there to be space in the published hard copy journal. And so there was never a question that Western needed help from them. In fact, I was done over a year before my term technically ended, except for final copy edits. I had some copy edit. That was done 6 months at a time. It was getting through the backlog that took the time.
Nice. But do they ever give you any sort of or request things related to alt metrics, impact factor?
In fact, they would sometimes provide data like that.
Yeah.
And our rankings were so good that they were, I think, understandably quite pleased with Western. Again, because we are helping setting disciplinary debate.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. So let's talk about the editorial board a little bit. Can you tell me how you choose them and what exactly does an editorial board for you do?
I asked advice from a couple former editors about people they'd found that were especially helpful. And and anybody they recommended, I then included on the editorial board. I also tried to make sure that it heavily represented the Western region, because this is a journal that represents the West, although it's also a national journal, as I explained. I made sure that the breadth of the discipline of communication studies was represented. And in this day and age, I was really concerned that we have a diversity of identity. That we had, so if we had an essay submitted on any aspect of the way that communication and argument and rhetoric helps create identity, or the way that perhaps authoritarian populists are undercutting identity, that we had appropriate reviewers who were both the insight and the sensitivity to praise good manuscripts. But if it weren't a good manuscript, if the manuscript were saying things that were either wrong or even worse, ideologically destructive, they'd call it out. So I made sure that we had that diversity. Diversity is a good idea. There are some people in all ways, and there are some people who push diversity and quality against each other. In my experience, they are reinforcing ideas, not inconsistent ideas. And so I make sure that the editorial board reflected the diversity of the discipline in identity in all other ways.
That makes sense. So can you tell me a little bit about what a week in the life of a journal editor was like?
Sure. At the beginning, when you don't have any manuscripts accepted, and there is a lag time in learning the arcane kind of medieval way that the reviewing technology works. At that point, you're learning that process, and getting reviewers is hard because you'll get a manuscript, and most of the time, the manuscript is not in your area of expertise. I don't care who the editor is, that's almost always going to be the way it is. Even in argumentation, we're all argumentation scholars, but we're not all scholars of the particular foci of a given essay. So that means that you read the manuscript, make sure it's appropriate for the journal. Most of the time it is appropriate for the journal. I had desk rejection of under, I think, right at 5%. At that point, you think about, how do you get reviewers? You think about, are there people on the editorial board who are appropriate for the subject area? And you have to make sure there isn't a conflict of interest. Then you think, one technique I used was I would look at the references and try to find people who were obviously experts in either methodology or subject area, and then I would email them. And that led to me finding many, many good reviewers. It also led to many, many rejections. So it was I spent an awful lot of time saying, okay, who's next on the list that I can ask to review this manuscript? Yeah. There were cases where the first couple people both accepted. More often than that, I would say I'd have to ask 5 or 6 to get 2. On a couple occasions, I went past a dozen before I found 2 qualified reviewers. And there are also circumstances where, if worst comes to worst, I knew people who could review almost anything. If any social scientific work could be reviewed by Dennis Gowron, now emeritus from Penn State. And I had more contacts in rhetoric and argumentation of people who in a pinch could review anything. But I tried not to take too much advantage of those people. Otherwise, the Dennis Gowrons of the world would have been doing 50 reviews a year.
Right.
And actually, in fairness, there's pretty much only one Dennis. An extraordinary reviewer.
Right. Right. So is there a particular flow throughout the year of in your experience?
A little bit. The summers are slower. The beginning of the fall semester, you'll get many, many submissions. It'll slow down over the holidays, and then a really big chunk of submissions you get in mid-January and early February. I think, especially in the social sciences, it would be common for people to submit the same essay they might be submitting to the NCA convention. I think that's
both at the same time.
I think that's less common among rhetorical and argumentation scholars.
And do you see any advantage or not to working in that way?
Well, it's just when the submissions come in. Yeah. And at Western, we had the luxury, we were never had a shortage of submissions. I stopped reviewing, I think, about 15 months. Now I started about 15 months early too, so it really was a 3-year cycle. But we never had any shortage of submissions. And I think there are journals where they are really dependent upon what's coming in at the moment. Thankfully, that was not a problem. Finding enough reviewers for 180 new submissions a year, and then replacing reviewers on resubmissions if someone begged off, that was a problem.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So let's talk about, you've already sort of told me what happens when you first get a manuscript and how you select reviewers. Let's say you get reviewer feedback now. What sort of impact or input do they give you? How do you weigh it? Tell me a little bit about your thought process as you're getting advice. And
and there is a continuum with anything else. And some reviewers provide enormously detailed feedback. Some reviewers, Dennis Gower and I mentioned, would sometimes copy edit a manuscript, which is enormously useful, and he is about the sharpest pen in the discipline. Much less often you'd get feedback that was quite general. So at that point, what I do is look at the feedback, and of course there's also a recommendation that goes with it, and look at my own judgment about the manuscript. I don't think we didn't ever, I don't think I ever accepted a manuscript after the first submission. And I very, very rarely accepted it with just mild but modest revision. Almost always manuscripts require significant revision. And so, for example, for young scholars, getting a revise and resubmit, sometimes they view that as, oh my word, I have to do more work on this. No. Getting a revise and resubmit is great news. And you should treat the feedback as a way to improve the manuscript and follow through on that. So I'd read the feedback and I would ask the question, can this manuscript be fixed given this feedback? And often I would have suggestions as well. And then if I thought it could, and if I thought it was making an important statement, then I would give a revise and resubmit. And I would give pretty specific guidance. I would often say, my judgment is these are the 6 things you need to do that are most important.
Yeah.
Because I find, when reviewers conflict, and I certainly have had that experience in my long career, when an editor doesn't tell me what to do, what the editor wants to do, that's hard.
Yeah.
And I would encourage young scholars, first, I hope editors will give that guidance, but I would encourage young scholars, if they get conflicting guidance from reviewers, to not be shy about asking the editor for advice. I certainly was never offended by that.
Yeah. So what do you do? So when you were an editor, you were pretty specific in what to do in those situations.
Right. And then when they resubmitted, and I would consider, before I did anything else, I would reread the manuscript and see if I believed it either had sufficiently made the revisions. And depending upon if substantial revisions were needed, I almost always would send it out for review by the same reviewers.
Yeah.
But when there was less needed, I would do a review of the manuscript myself. And if they had satisfied the reviewers, I might accept that pending minor revision. But there was always going to be minor revision either at that stage or in the copy edit stage.
Yeah. That makes sense.
On the other hand, if I had thought they hadn't done the revision, I rejected manuscripts at that stage. It was only when it was substantial revision and I thought, well, the reviewers really need to take a judgment on this, because I recognized how demanding the review process is on the reviewers. And frankly, I needed every reviewer I could get, and I knew I could only get 2 or 3, maybe the really generous 4 reviews a year. So I tried to protect the reviewers.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm hearing you say, if I'm hearing right, is that you are always weighing the political capital you have to ask of the reviewers when you are making a specific request of
but I would
the writer.
That's true, but I would never reject a manuscript because I thought I would have trouble getting reviewers. I'd just work harder.
Correct. Yeah. But that's why you're so specific with everybody, right? Is you're trying to give everyone the best possible opportunity to
Right.
succeed.
And I'm a pretty experienced person in this editorial review process myself. And I rapidly found that while methodological issues in the social sciences, I entirely deferred to the expert reviewers because I simply don't have that background. In terms of making arguments about the data and what it meant, my argumentation background put me in a very good position to help social scientists make arguments about their findings. And so I wasn't shy about doing that.
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds more almost like you're in a broker role, right? And you have to.
No, I think advisor. I'm trying to help them. I'm trying to help them make the strongest argument that they could make.
Yeah.
And I recognize that young scholars, I make a special effort for young scholars because they don't have the experience doing it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Advisor. Yeah, that's what I meant, not broker. Yeah, advisor. So any advice you'd give them when they're writing up their letter when addressing the reviewers?
First, I always encourage authors that they may have a formal letter to the editor, but you want to separate that from your response to the reviewers. And sometimes the reviewing software isn't as not glitch free. And so, if you could accidentally reveal who you are if it's all in just the letter, if the software doesn't work right. So what I would always advise people who advise people revising their articles is first, thank the reviewers for what they've done, and if appropriate, praise them for useful suggestions. I think almost always that's true. That's not ingratiation, that's a truthful statement. I think also I would say to people getting the comments or reviewers, everyone's first response is, but my essay was perfect as written. And it wasn't, because no essay is. And so put aside the reviews for a day and then look at them again and take what you can that you think is useful. And in the revision, either try to do what the reviewers say, or my word is account for what the reviewers say. Because sometimes you will get a potential objection and you will think, well, that isn't quite right. What you need to do is not refute the objection. You need to account for it in your revision. And so I would encourage authors to do that. And then I would be as specific as I could in accounting for the revisions in my explanation of those revisions. And if I was balancing things between different reviewers, I would tell the editor that, but I wouldn't tell the reviewers that, because you don't want to say to one reviewer, well, I found your comments less useful. You're just balancing things.
Yeah, that makes total sense. You have to keep in mind this is a rhetorical document too.
Oh, it is, but I think in our public sphere, we need to be nicer to each other, and we need to appreciate the hard work that our colleagues do. And that's an egregious problem in the public sphere, but academia, it's a problem too. And so I always tried to be appreciative to reviewers and also to young scholars. Even when I rejected things, if I could make suggestions of other journals or ways to go or praise them in some way, I tried to do that. In fact, I had thank yous on rejections, which I think it speaks to the graciousness of the young scholars.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's awesome. Yeah, we need more of that.
Yeah.
So what can I expect after resubmission?
Well, yeah, like I've described the process. I'm going to read it first myself.
Mm-hmm.
If there are substantial revisions, so it's not obvious that you've satisfied things, it's going to go back to the reviewers. Mm-hmm. If I think you have, I might say, I've read this. I think there are these three things you need still to do before I would consider accepting the manuscript. Or if I read it and think you're just not in the ballpark, I'm going to I'm probably going to reject it then, because it seems like you've had your shot to do this and it hasn't worked out.
Yeah, that makes sense. What has being an editor taught you about making an argument in the academic context?
Let me say one more thing before I answer that, and that's about when it gets accepted. And scholars should know that there is going to be a copy edit process. In the copy edit process, I had a terrific editorial assistant, now a fine young assistant professor, Jacob Justice, and he did all the APA and MLA checks. He was a master of that, and I'm so appreciative. But also, we'd have a copy edit process where I would go through and line edit the manuscript. One goal was to get as close to the 9,000 word norm of the journal as we could. My other goal is simply to make the writing as tight and cogent as possible. And in some cases, there were almost no edits. In some cases, there were more substantial edits. But that I was doing that, as editors have on occasion helped me do. I was trying to help the young authors, especially the younger scholars, make their manuscripts as powerful for influencing disciplinary debates as possible. And I found that almost without exception, they appreciated that process.
Yeah, I think that's important advice. Otherwise, sometimes you get an article that slips through with a massive, embarrassing typo, as I know far too well.
Or problems more fundamental than typos.
Yeah. So, what has it taught you about making an argument in the academic context?
In all cases, I think the introduction to an essay should establish what in rhetoric or argumentation I call a critical puzzle. There's something out there where there is a conflict in the literature. In rhetoric, it's often that messages resonate when it doesn't make much sense that they do resonate. I've written quite a bit about the inexplicable resonance of Donald Trump's rhetoric and argumentation, given his violation of norms of behavior, lack of ideology, constant gaffes, his ignorance of basic principles of syntax. We can go on and on. And so that's an example of a critical puzzle. In the social sciences, that often will be conflicting studies, or a theory has been extended to this far, but there's a new domain where it's not been extended. So I think beginning with some kind of puzzle that's out there, and then there'll be a transition where the author says, one way of addressing this puzzle would be to do, and it would be a rhetorical analysis, or build an argument, or develop a new theory, or conduct a social science study. All of those things are potential ways to answer the puzzle. And then preview theoretical development as needed. For the social scientists, methodological development. For rhetoricians and argumentation scholars, theory and method are really pretty similar in that what we are doing is applying theories to texts, to arguments, or other kinds of texts. And then I would encourage authors to dare to draw important conclusions. So don't be shy about pointing to major theoretical developments that need to be taken, or, for example, in a number of essays I've written about the public sphere, I have pointed out that especially cultural critics in the study of rhetoric and communication have been very worried about the hegemonic power of rational argument. And it is, I think, quite clear from our experience in the Trump years and other contexts too, that argument is not hegemonic. if argument were hegemonic, there are any number of the policies that Trump defended that we would have instantly rejected, and he would not have been the nominee, nor would he have been elected president. I could point to many other examples. It's just Trump is such an easy one. And that's that conclusion that argument is not hegemonic, and I push it more strongly than that. We'd be better off if rational argument had more power in our society, a lot better off. Let me just give you one example of that. I'll get back to my editorial discussion.
Yeah.
Per capita, the United States has 3 times as many deaths from COVID as Canada.
Mhm.
And Canada is the most similar country to us in the world. The primary difference is not healthcare, not access to vaccines, not access to any of that. It's that their political discourse is less dysfunctional than ours. And that's led to, less misinformation, less irrational opposition to vaccines and masking. So that's an example of how we'd be better off if rational argument worked better in the United States. So don't be shy about drawing big conclusions.
That's an interesting statistic.
Yeah, it's a depressing statistic.
Yeah. No, that's, I think, really good advice.
It's gotten worse over time, by the way. A year ago, Canada was at 37% of our fatality rate. Now it's, the last time I checked, which was in January, it was 33%, 32.6, I think.
It is depressing.
Yeah.
I like one of the other things I'm taking away from your advice about academic argument or inferring is that the introduction is super important itself.
Right, because you're explaining why this study matters, whatever it is. Yeah.
So start with the theoretical puzzle, but the start is the most important. Sounds like the most important part.
I think having an answer to the puzzle is probably the most important thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what else do you think we should know about the publishing process?
To young scholars, I would say you shouldn't be shy about submitting things. It seems so scary. You've never done it before. But remember that if you don't submit, it is very unlikely to be published. If you do submit, the worst thing that you can have happen to you is it's rejected. And those outcomes, I would say, are pretty similar. There's really not that much cost. Now, with that said, especially when you're just starting out, you want to, if you have for a PhD student, for example, you have what was a good essay for a class, for some kind of seminar you've taken. Run it by your advisor, make sure you have things in the right form, and check the format for the journal. And then if your advisor says, yes, it's in good shape, you should try, then I encourage you to do that. I mean, that was the way I did it 40 years ago, but it's a lot easier now with email to check with an editor. You get the responses much more rapidly. It is not true that when I submitted, we were relying on the Pony Express, but almost true at that point.
Yeah, I mean, you got to rely on mail, though.
Yeah.
Oh my God, absolutely. And a typewriter.
Absolutely. I go back before computers.
Yeah. Oh my.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. We really, really appreciate it.
It's my absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.
How about those Jayhawks?
Yeah, quite the championship.
And we got to the semis of the national debate tournament too.
Congratulations.